The most dangerous warrior is the one the world mistakes for someone who needs saving. Rain fell steadily across Blackstone Fortress as torches flickered against towering stone walls carved with the ancient crest of the Northern Kingdom. Representatives from every neighboring pack gathered beneath the castle gates to witness the signing of a long-awaited peace treaty, one meant to end decades of distrust and secure the fragile future of their people. Wagons carrying silver, grain, rare herbs, and ceremonial gifts rolled one after another across the drawbridge until only a single covered carriage remained waiting in the cold evening mist. Curious whispers spread through the crowd as the elderly Alpha, who led the Eastern delegation, slowly stepped forward. His weathered face revealed quiet regret rather than celebration. Without speaking, he opened the carriage door and offered his hand to the young woman waiting inside. Scarlett Bennett stepped into the rain wearing a simple gray traveling cloak that concealed almost every detail except her pale face and calm blue eyes. She lowered her gaze respectfully, accepting the silence surrounding her without complaint. The nobles exchanged puzzled glances before the old Alpha finally addressed the royal court. As part of our pledge of lasting peace, we offer this Omega to serve within the household of Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne. The words settled heavily across the courtyard. Some guests nodded with approval, believing the gesture honored ancient traditions. Others looked away, uncomfortable that a young woman had become part of a political agreement. Scarlett showed no emotion. She neither resisted nor pleaded. She simply stood with remarkable stillness while rain collected along the edge of her hood. From the highest balcony overlooking the ceremony, Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne watched everything unfold in thoughtful silence. Tall and composed, dressed in a dark ceremonial coat embroidered with silver thread, he studied the quiet Omega more carefully than the gifts surrounding her. Something about her posture felt unusual. She did not appear frightened. She did not seem defeated. Instead, she carried herself with the balanced stillness of someone who noticed every doorway, every guard tower, every shadow between the torchlight without ever turning her head. It lasted only a moment before she lowered her eyes once again, becoming exactly what everyone expected to see. A harmless Omega delivered as a symbol of peace. After the formal ceremony ended, Captain Ethan Mercer escorted Scarlett through the fortress toward the royal residence. Servants quietly prepared comfortable chambers for her while noble guests continued celebrating the successful treaty. As they crossed the inner courtyard, Scarlett's gaze briefly drifted toward the outer walls where royal sentries changed positions with practiced precision. She silently counted the rotation without realizing Alexander had paused several steps behind, observing the direction of her attention. Most newcomers admired the castle. She studied its defenses. The thought lingered in his mind long after she disappeared inside the residence. Later that night, while music echoed through the grand banquet hall, Scarlett stood alone beside a narrow window overlooking the moonlit forest stretching beyond the fortress walls. The rain had stopped, leaving silver light scattered across the ancient pines below. For the first time since arriving, she quietly removed a pair of worn leather gloves from her cloak and traced a faded mark hidden across her palm before slipping the gloves back into place. It happened so quickly that no servant noticed. No noble paid attention. No one questioned why an ordinary Omega carried the rough, weathered hands of someone who had spent years surviving far beyond the safety of any kingdom. Only the silent forest seemed to recognize her, and somewhere beyond the distant tree line, a lone wolf lifted its head toward the moon as though greeting the return of a legend the world had long believed was gone. The following morning the fortress awakened beneath a pale gray sky as servants hurried through long stone corridors preparing breakfast for visiting nobles before the peace delegation returned home. Scarlett Bennett rose before sunrise without waiting for anyone to summon her. Years of disciplined habits refused to disappear simply because her surroundings had changed. She quietly opened the narrow window of her chamber and allowed the cool mountain air to fill the room while her eyes instinctively traveled across the fortress walls, the watchtowers, the forest beyond the gates, and the winding road disappearing into the valley below. She noticed the changing of the guards before the signal bell rang, counted the distance between every watch post, and silently measured how long it would take someone to cross the courtyard during the quietest hour before dawn. Only after satisfying herself that she understood the rhythm of the fortress did she step away from the window. Moments later, a young servant arrived carrying fresh clothing chosen for members of the royal household. Scarlett accepted everything with quiet gratitude, thanking the nervous girl so sincerely that the servant left the room smiling with visible relief. Throughout the morning, Scarlett spoke very little. She helped elderly attendants carry heavy baskets through the kitchens, arranged fresh herbs in the infirmary without being asked, and gently comforted a frightened stable colt that refused to enter its stall after being startled by thunder during the night. Every task appeared ordinary, yet every movement reflected remarkable awareness. She never blocked a doorway. She never turned her back toward an open corridor. She always seemed to know where everyone stood without constantly looking around. Most people dismissed it as caution. One person did not. From the second-floor gallery, overlooking the training courtyard, Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne watched Scarlett pause beside the outer wall while pretending to admire the gardens below. Captain Ethan Mercer joined him carrying the morning patrol reports. "She has caused no trouble," Ethan said. "The servants already seemed to like her." Alexander remained silent for a moment before answering. "Have you noticed that she never startles?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Alexander folded his arms thoughtfully. A tray slipped from a servant's hands earlier. Every person nearby turned toward the sound after it happened. She moved before it reached the floor. Ethan considered the observation but offered a practical explanation. "Perhaps she has quick reflexes." Alexander nodded slowly, though the answer did not fully satisfy him. Later that afternoon, a group of young nobles wandered through the castle gardens discussing the treaty. One of them glanced towards Scarlett with open amusement. "Imagine being sent across the kingdom as nothing more than another peace offering," he remarked carelessly. Scarlett heard every word but continued tending the herb beds beside an elderly gardener who had quietly welcomed her that morning. She simply asked the old man another question about growing mountain lavender before helping him lift a heavy watering barrel that would normally require 2 workers. The gardener blinked with surprise at her effortless balance, but Scarlett only smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. High above the courtyard, Alexander witnessed the entire exchange. He was not interested in the careless remark made by the nobleman. His attention remained fixed upon the calm Omega, who never defended herself with words, never sought sympathy, and never behaved like someone who believed she was powerless. As evening settled across Blackstone Fortress and shadows stretched toward the surrounding forest, Alexander found himself asking the same question for the 3rd time that day. Who exactly was Scarlett Bennett before she arrived at his gates, and why did every ordinary answer seem less convincing the longer he watched her? By the 3rd morning, life inside Blackstone Fortress had settled into its familiar rhythm, yet an uneasy feeling quietly spread among the royal scouts returning from the northern border. Horses arrived covered in dust, their riders speaking in hushed voices as maps were unrolled across the command table inside the guard tower. Captain Ethan Mercer listened carefully, while experienced trackers described a series of unusual footprints discovered deep within the old pine forest beyond the kingdom's frontier. The marks were unlike those left by ordinary wolves. They appeared only briefly before disappearing across rocky ground where even the most skilled scouts could no longer follow the trail. When Ethan presented the report to Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne, the council debated possible explanations. Some believed wandering rogues had crossed the border. Others dismissed the signs as the work of ordinary travelers. Alexander studied the rough sketches drawn by his patrol leaders without reaching a conclusion. Later that afternoon, copies of the same sketches were carried through the fortress for review. One page happened to slip from a messenger's hands as he hurried along a quiet corridor where Scarlett Bennett was arranging fresh herbs beside an open window. The paper drifted to the floor at her feet. She instinctively bent down to return it, but the moment her eyes fell upon the hand-drawn tracks, her calm expression changed almost too quickly to notice. She recognized the pattern immediately. The spacing between each print, the angle of the claws, and the broken rhythm along one edge revealed something no ordinary tracker would have noticed at first glance. Whatever had crossed the border had not been wandering. It had been scouting. More importantly, it would return before sunrise after completing a wide circle through the surrounding hills. For the briefest moment, old instincts awakened inside her with startling clarity. She almost spoke. Instead, years of carefully protecting her identity reminded her why silence had once become her safest companion. She handed the report back to the messenger with the same gentle smile she offered everyone else. "Please be careful," she said softly. "Important papers should not be lost." The young messenger thanked her before rushing away, never realizing she had memorized every detail on the page within seconds. That evening, Scarlett stood alone beside the outer wall, overlooking the dark forest stretching beneath the moonlight. A cool wind carried the scent of damp earth and evergreen trees across the battlements. She closed her eyes for only a heartbeat, allowing familiar memories to surface. Countless nights spent reading broken branches, scattered feathers, disturbed moss, and silent trails had taught her that forests always spoke to those patient enough to listen. When she opened her eyes again, her quiet voice barely rose above the wind. "They will return before sunrise." She believed no one had heard the words. Yet several yards away, hidden within the shadow of a stone archway, Alexander had paused during his evening inspection just in time to catch the whispered warning. He looked toward the distant tree line, then back toward Scarlett, who had already resumed her peaceful expression as though she had never spoken at all. The words lingered in his thoughts long after darkness settled across the fortress, because something deep within his instincts told him that the quiet Omega understood the forest far better than anyone had ever dared to imagine. Before the first hint of dawn touched the mountains, an urgent horn echoed across Blackstone Fortress, pulling guards from their watchtowers and sending mounted patrols racing toward the northern gate. Captain Ethan Mercer had received word that the strange tracks discovered the previous day had appeared again, this time much closer to the kingdom's border than anyone expected. Torches flickered against the fortress walls as soldiers prepared to investigate before sunrise. Standing near the stable yard with a basket of fresh herbs intended for the infirmary, Scarlett Bennett quietly watched the patrol assemble. She recognized the direction they intended to ride, and a faint shadow crossed her calm expression. The trail they planned to follow would lead them through a narrow ravine where visibility disappeared long before daylight reached the forest floor. She knew the place well, although no one inside the fortress had ever heard her speak its name. As Captain Ethan prepared to give the order to depart, Scarlett stepped forward only once. "If the mist settles before sunrise," she said softly, "the western ridge will be safer than the valley path." Ethan looked at her with polite confusion. "Have you traveled those woods before?" Scarlett lowered her eyes for the briefest moment. "Only from stories," she answered gently. Ethan offered a courteous nod before continuing with the original route, believing the advice came from little more than hopeful guessing. From the balcony, above the courtyard, Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne observed the brief exchange without interruption. He remembered her whispered warning from the previous evening, and although reason offered no explanation, instinct urged him to reconsider the patrol's course. Moments before the riders crossed the fortress gate, Alexander called down to Ethan, "Take both routes. Divide the patrol." The captain immediately obeyed without question. Half the guards continued toward the valley, while the remaining riders climbed the western ridge overlooking the forest below. Scarlett quietly released the breath she had been holding. Hours passed beneath a pale gray sky before the first patrol returned. The riders who had taken the ridge reported clear visibility and a safe journey. The second group emerged much later, their horses exhausted after becoming trapped inside heavy morning fog that had settled exactly where Scarlett had predicted. They had eventually found an alternate path without injury, but valuable time had been lost navigating the hidden ravine. As soldiers compared their experiences, several quietly admitted that the western route would have been the wiser choice from the beginning. Alexander listened without revealing his thoughts. That afternoon, he walked alone along the outer battlements where Scarlett was tending flowering herbs growing beside the ancient stone wall. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine through the fortress as he stopped several feet away. "Your stories know these forests remarkably well," he remarked calmly. Scarlett continued watering the plants before answering. Sometimes old stories remember truths people forget. Alexander studied her for a long moment. She never sounded defensive. She never sounded afraid. Every answer carried quiet confidence without revealing more than she wished to share. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant mountains, Alexander watched Scarlett return to her simple work while a single question settled deeper inside his thoughts than ever before. If an ordinary Omega could read unfamiliar wilderness more accurately than experienced Royal Scouts, then perhaps she had never been ordinary at all. And somewhere beneath the peaceful silence, she carried every day rested a life that no one inside Blackstone Fortress had even begun to uncover. The unusual events along the northern border became the quiet focus of every conversation inside Blackstone Fortress during the following days. Scouts continued discovering fresh signs that someone had been studying the forests without leaving clear traces behind. Each report seemed to deepen Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne's curiosity rather than his concern, because one detail refused to leave his thoughts. Every prediction Scarlett Bennett had quietly offered had proven correct. She never exaggerated. She never claimed special knowledge. She simply noticed what others overlooked. Determined to understand how an ordinary Omega possessed such remarkable instincts, Alexander instructed Captain Ethan Mercer to search the royal archives for any record connected to Scarlett Bennett or her family. The request appeared simple enough, yet hours passed before the elderly archivist returned carrying a small collection of weathered documents covered with years of dust. Most contained little more than basic records from Eastern territories, listing Scarlett as an Omega born to a respected but unremarkable family. Nothing explained her unusual awareness or calm confidence. As the archivist prepared to leave, he hesitated before placing one final sealed folder upon the table. This file was misfiled years ago among old border reports, he explained quietly. The name caught my attention because it matches the woman now living in the fortress. Alexander carefully opened the faded folder. Inside rested an old patrol report describing a mysterious hunter who had repeatedly guided lost travelers away from dangerous mountain passes without ever revealing a true identity. Witnesses offered conflicting descriptions because no one had seen the hunter clearly, yet every account repeated the same unusual details. A gray traveling cloak, calm blue eyes, remarkable skill reading forests and tracking hidden paths. Beside the final report appeared a single handwritten note from a retired border commander. If the silent hunter truly exists, our frontier remains safe because of someone who asks for neither reward nor recognition. Alexander slowly lowered the page, his thoughts returning to Scarlett standing quietly beside the herb garden, advising experienced scouts with gentle certainty while expecting nothing in return. Could coincidence truly explain so many similarities? That afternoon, he walked through the castle courtyard where Scarlett knelt beside an injured hunting hawk brought back by one of the royal falconers. The proud bird refused food from everyone else, yet it remained perfectly calm as Scarlett carefully cleaned its damaged wing before offering fresh water from her own hands. Alexander watched unnoticed from the covered walkway. She moved with extraordinary patience, never forcing the frightened animal to trust her. The hawk eventually accepted the water and settled peacefully against the folded blanket beside her. "You have done this before," Alexander said as he quietly approached. Scarlett looked up with the same composed expression she always carried. "Every living creature deserves kindness when it is frightened," she answered. Alexander studied her weathered gloves resting beside the basket of herbs. For the first time, he noticed faint scars crossing the backs of her hands, old marks left by years spent surviving difficult places rather than working inside peaceful homes. She calmly slipped the gloves back on before he could ask about them. Neither of them spoke again for several moments, yet Alexander felt another piece of the hidden puzzle quietly fall into place. The mysterious reports buried inside forgotten archives, the remarkable understanding of forests, the effortless awareness, the scarred hands, and the humble silence all pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Somewhere beneath the quiet life Scarlett Bennett now lived inside Blackstone Fortress remained the forgotten story of someone extraordinary and Alexander realized he was no longer trying to solve a mystery simply because he was curious. He was beginning to understand that the greatest guardian his kingdom had never known might already be standing quietly within its walls. The quiet mystery surrounding the northern border finally changed one cold morning when a frightened messenger arrived at Blackstone Fortress, carrying urgent reports from the outer watch posts. Several supply wagons traveling through the pine forest had failed to arrive on schedule, not because they had been attacked, but because the drivers had become hopelessly lost after following unfamiliar trails that seemed to disappear without warning. Experienced scouts immediately prepared a search party, yet every map they studied offered different explanations. Some insisted the missing caravans had crossed the eastern ridge. Others believed they had wandered toward the old river valley. As voices filled the command chamber with uncertainty, Scarlett Bennett quietly studied the rough sketches spread across the table while standing near the doorway with a basket of medical supplies intended for the infirmary. She needed only a few seconds before recognizing a simple pattern hidden beneath the conflicting reports. The missing wagons had not taken different routes at all. They had unknowingly followed the same looping trail created by shifting landmarks inside the dense forest after recent storms. Scarlett gently set the basket aside and looked toward Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne. For the first time since arriving at the fortress, she spoke with unmistakable certainty. If we leave now and approach from the northern ridge instead of the river, we will reach them before sunset. The room fell completely silent. Several officers exchanged uncertain glances. One senior scout politely shook his head. "Your Majesty, with respect, that route is too steep for supply wagons." Scarlett calmly met his eyes. That is exactly why the missing drivers never went there. They believed the easier path was safer. Alexander noticed something different in her voice. There was no hesitation, no careful attempt to hide behind uncertainty. She sounded like someone who had walked those forests 100 times. Without another question, he made his decision. "Captain Ethan, prepare 2 patrols. Miss Bennett will ride with us." Surprise swept through the chamber, yet no one challenged the order. Within the hour, the expedition entered the ancient pines beneath a pale winter sky. Scarlett rode quietly near the front, saying almost nothing as she observed broken branches, scattered pine needles, faint impressions in damp earth, and birds unexpectedly changing direction above the trees. After several miles, she gently raised one hand, signaling the patrol to stop. She dismounted, knelt beside what appeared to be an ordinary patch of moss, and lightly brushed away fallen leaves, revealing the nearly invisible imprint of a wagon wheel hidden beneath fresh debris. Captain Ethan stared in disbelief. None of the experienced trackers had noticed it. Scarlett rose calmly and pointed toward a narrow trail, climbing the hillside. They turned there after mist covered the valley. No one questioned her this time. Hours later, the patrol reached a sheltered clearing where the missing wagons stood safely surrounded by confused merchants who had spent the entire night searching for a road that had been only a short distance away. Relief spread through the group as families embraced one another and supplies were prepared for the journey home. Captain Ethan quietly turned toward Alexander. No ordinary Omega could have found them. Alexander watched Scarlett thanking the weary drivers before helping children climb back into the wagons with the same quiet kindness she showed everyone else. The mystery that had surrounded her from the day she entered Blackstone Fortress no longer felt like rumor or coincidence. It had become undeniable truth. The woman every kingdom believed had arrived as a simple gift possessed abilities that even his finest trackers could not match, and for the first time, those who had once overlooked her no longer saw an Omega standing among them. They saw someone extraordinary whose true story had only just begun to reveal itself. When the rescue party returned to Blackstone Fortress, the story spread through the castle faster than the winter wind crossing the mountains. Servants whispered that the quiet Omega had guided the royal patrol through a forest where even veteran trackers had lost their way. Soldiers repeated the tale with growing respect, while older scouts quietly compared the details with stories they had once heard about a legendary hunter who seemed able to read the wilderness as though every tree and every stone spoke directly to her. Scarlett Bennett ignored every rumor. The following morning, she was once again helping prepare medicinal herbs inside the infirmary, speaking gently with recovering travelers and offering warm tea to exhausted guards as though nothing unusual had happened. Her remarkable ability had never changed the way she saw herself. It only changed the way others began looking at her. Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne carried the unanswered questions with him throughout the day until, as evening settled across the fortress, he finally asked Scarlett to meet him in the quiet library overlooking the northern valley. The room glowed with the soft light of burning fireplaces, while shelves filled with centuries of royal records surrounded them in peaceful silence. Scarlett entered wearing the same simple gray cloak she had worn since arriving at the fortress, her weathered gloves still covering the faded scars on her hands. Alexander gestured toward a chair beside the window, but remained standing himself. "I owe you my gratitude," he began calmly. "Without your guidance, those families might have remained lost for another night." Scarlett inclined her head politely. "I only followed the signs the forest offered." Alexander looked at her with steady curiosity. "Most people never see those signs." For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Scarlett gazed through the tall window toward the moonlit pines stretching across the distant hills before quietly removing one glove from her right hand. The old scars crossing her palm caught the firelight for only a moment. "These were not earned inside peaceful castles," she said softly. Alexander remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "Years ago, I served along the western frontier where villages depended upon hunters more than soldiers. We protected travelers, guided lost children home, and learned to survive in forests that changed with every season. People eventually gave the hunter a name, but the work was never about becoming a legend. It was about making certain others reached home safely." Alexander slowly reached toward a weathered journal resting upon the table. Inside lay a copied report from the Royal Archives describing the mysterious silent hunter. He placed the page before Scarlett without speaking. She studied the familiar words before offering the faintest smile. "I wondered if anyone had kept those old reports." Alexander finally understood. The silent hunter was never a story. Scarlett gently shook her head.
"No."
She was simply someone who stayed where others were afraid to go. He looked at her with quiet admiration rather than disbelief. "Why disappear?" The question lingered in the warm library until Scarlett answered with calm honesty. "Because after years of living beside danger, I no longer wished to be remembered for what I could do. I only wanted the chance to live as an ordinary person." Alexander lowered his eyes thoughtfully before meeting her gaze once more. "The extraordinary rarely chooses itself," he said. "Sometimes it simply chooses to serve without asking for recognition." For the first time since arriving at Blackstone Fortress, Scarlett allowed herself a peaceful smile untouched by old memories. She realized the Alpha King standing before her no longer saw an Omega delivered through a political treaty. He saw the woman she had always been, and instead of asking her to prove her worth, he simply honored the truth she had finally trusted him enough to reveal. The announcement surprised the entire fortress before sunrise the following day. Standing before the assembled royal guard in the central courtyard, Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne calmly declared that Scarlett Bennett would accompany Captain Ethan Mercer as chief advisor during every future border patrol. A wave of astonished whispers spread through the gathered soldiers. Some exchanged uncertain glances, remembering only weeks earlier when Scarlett had arrived through the castle gates as a quiet Omega included within a peace agreement. Now the Alpha King himself was publicly placing his trust in her judgment. Alexander ignored every doubtful expression. "Skill should be recognized wherever it is found," he said with steady confidence. "The safety of this kingdom depends upon wisdom, not appearances." Scarlett accepted the responsibility without celebration. She simply inclined her head with quiet respect and thanked him for his trust before joining the morning expedition. The patrol rode toward the northern forest beneath a clear winter sky where fresh snow covered every trail from the previous night. Captain Ethan glanced toward Scarlett after several miles. "Where do we begin?" he asked sincerely. She studied the silent landscape for only a moment before pointing toward a line of ancient cedar trees untouched by the strongest winds. Snow hides footprints, she explained gently, but it cannot hide the places where frightened birds refuse to land. Several younger scouts followed her gaze and quickly noticed what they had completely overlooked. A long stretch of branches remained strangely empty despite the bright morning. Guided by Scarlett's observations, the patrol adjusted its route and soon discovered a forgotten mountain pass that had gradually become blocked by fallen trees after years without maintenance. The path had once connected isolated villages to the main trade road, but almost no one still remembered it. Scarlett quietly explained that restoring the passage would shorten winter travel for hundreds of families while also giving border patrols a safer route during heavy storms. Captain Ethan smiled with open admiration. "We spent years searching for better roads," he admitted. "You found one simply by listening to the forest." Over the following weeks, Scarlett worked beside engineers, scouts, carpenters, and local villagers, sharing everything she knew without ever acting as though she stood above anyone else. Experienced trackers who had once questioned her abilities now eagerly asked for her advice on reading weather patterns, understanding animal behavior, and recognizing subtle changes in mountain terrain. She answered every question with patience, reminding them that the wilderness rewarded those willing to observe before rushing to conclusions. Alexander often watched these lessons from a distance, quietly, appreciating how naturally respect had replaced doubt. No speeches had forced people to trust Scarlett. Her actions had done that on their own. As the restored mountain pass officially reopened, families from nearby villages gathered to celebrate the safer journey between their homes and the fortress. Children presented Scarlett with a hand-carved wooden wolf as a simple token of gratitude. She accepted the gift with gentle emotion, thanking them as though it were the greatest honor she had ever received. Standing beside her before the grateful crowd, Alexander understood that true leadership was never about placing extraordinary people above everyone else. It was about giving them the opportunity to help others become stronger together. Looking across the smiling faces filling the mountain pass, he realized the kingdom had gained something far more valuable than a legendary hunter. It had gained a teacher whose greatest talent was not surviving the wilderness, but helping others discover the courage, wisdom, and compassion that had always been waiting inside themselves. Spring returned to the northern kingdom with clear skies stretching above the ancient pine forests, and for the first time in many years the northern frontier stood more peaceful than anyone could remember. Trade caravans traveled safely through the restored mountain pass, children crossed woodland trails without fear, and villages once separated by difficult terrain now welcomed visitors from every neighboring territory. People often spoke about the remarkable changes brought by the quiet Omega who had arrived at Blackstone Fortress without title, reputation, or expectation. Yet Scarlett Bennett continued living exactly as she always had, greeting every traveler with kindness, teaching young scouts how to understand the language of the forest, and reminding every new recruit that patience would always reveal more than pride. On the morning of the annual gathering, representatives from allied packs assembled inside the great courtyard where the peace treaty had first been signed months before. The same stone walls, the same towering banners, and the same ancient gates stood before them. Yet, the atmosphere felt completely different. Alpha King Alexander Blackthorne stepped onto the ceremonial platform and looked across the assembled crowd before inviting Scarlett to stand beside him. She hesitated only briefly before accepting, wearing the same simple gray cloak that had accompanied her from the day she first entered the fortress. Alexander smiled quietly, understanding that neither honors nor admiration had ever changed the woman standing beside him. He turned toward the gathered leaders and spoke with calm conviction. Many believe this kingdom received an ordinary Omega as part of a treaty between neighboring packs. They were mistaken. Complete silence settled across the courtyard. Scarlett Bennett never asked for recognition. She never demanded authority. She never sought praise for the countless lives she protected long before any of us learned her name. The greatest guardian this kingdom has ever known entered these gates without announcing who she was, because true greatness does not introduce itself. It simply chooses to serve. Every noble, every soldier, and every visiting elder listened in respectful silence. Alexander then removed the silver wolf insignia worn only by the kingdom's most trusted protectors and carefully fastened it to Scarlett's cloak. From this day forward, he declared, Scarlett Bennett will serve as royal guardian of the northern frontier, not because she was given to this kingdom, but because this kingdom is honored that she chose to remain. The courtyard erupted into heartfelt applause that echoed against the ancient fortress walls. Scarlett looked across the smiling faces before gently lowering her head in gratitude. A forest remains safe because every tree stands together, she said softly. No guardian ever protects a kingdom alone. Her humble words touched the crowd even more deeply than the ceremony itself. As evening sunlight painted the mountains with shades of gold, Scarlett and Alexander stood together upon the fortress wall overlooking the endless sea of ancient pines. A cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar through the air, while wolves howled peacefully somewhere beyond the distant hills. Alexander looked toward the horizon with quiet contentment. You changed this kingdom without ever trying to rule it, he said. Scarlett smiled gently before answering. Sometimes the strongest path is simply helping people find their own way home. Together they watched the last light settle across the forest where legends had once been born and forgotten. From that day forward, whenever travelers crossed the northern frontier, they no longer spoke only of the Alpha King who protected the realm. They also remembered the quiet Omega who arrived as a forgotten gift, revealed herself as the greatest hunter alive, and taught an entire kingdom that true strength is measured not by the titles people receive, but by the lives they choose to protect with courage, humility, and compassion.